Mental Barbell, your go-to resource for everything mental performance. We're here to talk about sports, psychology, and sports psychology, and everything in between. Welcome to the ultimate mental performance journey. Welcome to the Mental Barbell. My name is Ian, and today we're speaking with the coaches of the Mental Barbell, Mike Mancini and Anthony Carnevale. Welcome, fellas. How are you?
Doing great, Ian. Good to see you, and good to see you, Anthony.
Great to see everybody. Happy to be back for another episode.
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got an exciting time in sports. We're winding up the Stanley Cup playoffs. We've got the NBA Finals going on. Obviously we're kind of thinking about the wind down of the Winter Olympics. I know that's passed a little bit, but I think for athletes, that's still, very much top of mind. So let's jump right into it. Right up front, we're going to talk about some news stories and then give our kind of opinions on them from a sports psychology angle. We've got a main topic today that's really interesting and backed by some research that we'll talk about. And then we've also have a continuation of our mental fitness challenge from last month, that I'm really excited about. And I think you all will be really excited about too. So without further ado, we'll jump into it. What kind of news have you guys been following, or what things in sports have you been watching?
I've been just following a lot of MLB and baseball. Huge Cub fan here, being in from the Great Lakes area, and kind of following the ebbs and flows of the Cubs. They were on a really, really hot streak, and now they've kind of hit the skids, and their young star, Pete Crow Armstrong's had some difficulties, and actually talked about trying to keep emotional composure in check because he's a real emotional guy, and how that's affected his play and so forth, which is interesting from a kid who's only like 22 or 23 in his second full season in the bigs, and trying to understand that whole mental aspect of staying focused and staying emotionally composed even when things are a little bit challenging. So interesting to kind of follow.
Yeah, and I know, the Cubs have been one of the teams, at least that I've been aware of, that have really embraced mental performance and sports psychology with Ken Ravizza and a lot of their infrastructure that they've set up. So I'm curious to see how that already in place infrastructure helps some of those younger athletes. You also mentioned that you're going to a game there at Wrigley Field tomorrow. So I'd be interested to see, what your experience, watching games on TV and versus that live experience would be. Do you have any thoughts or experiences based on that?
No, although it'll be interesting. They were, to your point about mental performance coaching, they were interviewing PCA, as they call them, after we're recording this on Friday, after Wednesday's game, and he talked about going to talk to their mental performance folks. And then there was speculation that one of the things that Craig Counsell, their manager, might do, they had an off day yesterday, is to give Pete an extra day off today just to observe from the dugout, just to kind of take a breath and exhale. And because I think one of the things that he even mentioned, that he put an extra amount of pressure on himself coming into the season. He hasn't started out very well, and now that the team's going a little bit south over the last week, he feels like he's an integral part of why they're doing that, and so that put a little extra pressure on him. One of the emotional outbursts that he mentioned was after the White Sox game last weekend, where he tried to make a play, didn't make it. Some fans in the stands got on him, and then he responded back and apologized for it later. So it was just a kind of a culmination of things. So it'd be interesting to see. Number one, hopefully he plays when we go watch him, because he's an exciting player, but it'll be interesting to see kind of how they play out as a team, how they work with putting him in or not in. Do you help him grind it out? Do you help him take a day off and just kind of relax a little bit and just kind of watch a game and be a good teammate, or how that might work out as well too. But it was interesting for him to specifically call out his issues and how he wants to address those.
Yeah, I love that. And I also imagine, being early in the season, that sense of pressure kind of comes from thinking about the season as a whole, right? You might have a couple bad games and you're like, man, there's hundreds of games to be played here. It's going to be a long road. But I think taking a break can really give you that short-term perspective, to, like you said, just slow the pace down, break up that breakneck tempo of games after games and games, just enough to give yourself that psychological reprieve. I think that's it's great to see it from those professional athletes too.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Another story that I've been kind of following from the swimming world, and it's my neck of the woods, has been Ryan Lochte. He's been in the news and out of the news for some not so great reasons, and he's had some personal kind of troubles along the way. And for anyone who's unaware of who Ryan Lochte is, he would have been a generational swimmer and was a generational swimmer. It just kind of overshadowed by Michael Phelps and everything that Phelps was able to do. For those of us in the swimming world, Ryan Lochte is excuse me, pretty much a household name, just like Michael Phelps is. He had some issues in, I believe it was like a World Championships or maybe Pan American Games where they were down in Brazil. He had some teammates of his and him. I think they vandalized the gas station and were arrested, and just a lot of personal turmoil. And he just accepted a assistant coaching job at Missouri State, I believe, at Mizzou. Could be wrong about that, but the point being, it really is a kind of fall from grace for someone like that. And I wanted to get both of your opinions on this in terms of athletic identity and how that can affect an athlete's well-being after their competitive career is kind of over. I think that's really what we saw with Lochte and his personal life, is he had put so much import and care and attention into developing this identity as an athlete. And then once your last Olympics, roll around and you retire, you kind of hang up the goggles, there's kind of a sense of what next. And I think we saw maybe the downside of not having a strong structured plan for what comes after sport. So, I'd love to hear your opinions on, what you've done with athletes in this kind of identity foreclosure stage, but also how to prevent some of this catastrophic identity foreclosure that we might be seeing here with Ryan. So what were some of your takes on that story?
Yeah, unfortunately, I don't know if it's like a very uncommon thing to hear, particularly with somebody who has been as successful as Ryan Lochte has been. I think the challenging part is a lot of the times when maybe hyper successful athletes like him, like Ryan, end up retiring from sport. I think oftentimes the thoughts are, well, what am I without swimming? What am I without X, Y, Z, or whatever sport you're playing? There's a transferable skills piece to it, showing up, working hard, communicating with teammates, leadership, all these other qualities that come with being an athlete and a successful one that transfer to other areas in life. One activity that I've done with other athletes that have been contemplating retirement or are retiring, particularly like recently for me, because the school year is coming to an end. So all the seniors, mostly where I work, are going to be retiring from like competitive sports. That doesn't mean they're not going to maybe do it recreationally. As like this wheel of life kind of idea where it's just a wheel or a circle and like there's different areas. So like athletics, social, maybe even financial a little bit now, and these and a couple other areas. And it's like it goes from like 1 to 10 and like just coloring in what number you think you are. So like maybe for them 10 might be like for the athletic identity, and other areas might be a little bit lower. And I think the visualization piece of it helps to maybe see like where the areas of growth can be. I think it's easy maybe to not recognize it until you see it. So even something as simple as that can be helpful in like recognizing areas for improvement or things to maybe pursue once they retire from sport or a competitive sport.
Yeah, and to go along with that, Anthony, I think, and I know both you guys work with athletes all the time that struggle with this even before retirement, especially when things don't go well. They have wrapped their identity so much around their role in the sport. When I work with high school kids and some small college folks as well too, even at that level, that's all they've known up to this point. They're known as Mike Mancini, the high school junior pitcher, or Mike Mancini, the sophomore basketball guard. And yes, I still take some classes, and yes, I have a personal life, but if I don't do well, or if I have a series of games that aren't going well for me, I've worked with athletes who struggle in other areas of their life then as well too. They struggle academically because they're feeling that everyone is looking at them as that athlete who is like screwing up on the court or screwing up on the baseball field and whatnot. And so even trying to extrapolate and work with athletes on, this is a role that you have, and I know you're passionate about it, but let's look at all the other roles you have as a human being. And to Anthony's point, I try and, similar to when we talk about what's in your control and out of your control, we do a list, and we try and do a lot of sports journaling when we talk with athletes. And that's one of the things I ask athletes to do consistently. Write down, keep a journal, remember what your role is here. And if you're struggling with an identity piece, ask yourself, is this more of a piece that I can put in my sports role, in my athlete role, or is this more in an academic role, or is my role as a brother or a sister or a son or a daughter or a friend or whatnot as well too. So even that day to day can sometimes play a part of, getting so wrapped up into your identity as an athlete that you lose that boundary gets diffused, and it kind of almost envelops who you are as a person. And trying to help extrapolate that a little bit kind of gives them a little bit better perspective, which then helps on the sports side as well too, because then they realize it's like, whoa, it's not my entire persona that's getting affected here. It's just I've had a couple of bad games shooting threes or something like that.
Yeah. Sorry, Anthony, go ahead.
Yeah, I think just adding on to that, like the bad game of shooting threes example is like that is just one game. Like one game, one season, one play doesn't define your athletic identity. And I think when we get really attached to it, sometimes it feels like it does. And it drastically impacts performance, and it takes our focus away from what's important. So yeah, I just wanted to kind of put the hammer on the nail there a little bit. Like one play, one season, even one little outcome of a game does not define you as an athlete.
Absolutely. And that speaks to that performance piece. That's how it shows up in performance, right? Because if you miss a free throw that you should have made or something like that, the rest of the game isn't going to be negatively impacted by that moment if you have that broader perspective. So I think that's a great point. Some of the things that stuck out to me were, especially in the Ryan Lochte story, in the article they interviewed him, and he talked about the most surprising thing about him trying to get a job was that the teams he was interviewing with were more interested in him as Ryan Lochte, the person, versus Ryan Lochte, the swimmer. Like they didn't really care about him as the swimmer. And it almost, in his quote, he almost was like surprised by that. Like he had never really thought about himself other than Ryan Lochte, the swimmer. And I thought that was a really revealing piece of this whole, process where, Mike, I love the word that you used the word like enveloped, because that swimming identity enveloped everything. It was his family life, it was his personal life, it was his athletic life, it was his financial life, to Anthony, to your point, and so then when that disappears, kind of that wheel, as you said, the whole thing falls apart. And that's really what we saw. And now we're seeing, this person try to kind of rebuild that identity, now using things like family, using things like being a support figure for younger athletes, right? And so I think it's more of a cautionary tale for anyone. And I also think this is more of a sports at large picture, but with the introduction of NIL money and things like that, it's just going to become a bigger problem. You can imagine these 18, 19, 20-year-old players who are getting millions of dollars for playing their sport. That's not going to be there when they're 25, right? When they retire and so now you're incorporating that financial component into athletics, into academics, probably into personal life. And so if these athletes aren't aware of that identity component, I think it's going to make that retirement process even more treacherous, I should say.
Yeah, and I think to just kind of follow up on that, Ian, to your point about separating the identity, we work a lot with athletes who struggle with social approval. I don't know how many times I've talked to an athlete, and one of their concerns or one of their fears is, hey, I don't want to let my parents down who have paid, all this money for me to get extra instruction. So they took me to a hitting coach and a pitching coach and a swing coach if you're a golfer, or set up a workout program with a specialized strength and conditioning coach and so forth. I don't want to let them down. I don't want to let coaches down. I don't want to let teammates down. And when you work with an athlete to realize that can be separated out, to your point about Ryan Lochte getting surprised when folks were looking at him as a person versus the coach, I think a lot of athletes get surprised when they start to do that exercise as well, too, going, wait, my dad's not going to take me home if I go 0 for 3 tonight. He is actually going to do that, instead of like leaving me in the parking lot because I didn't hit a home run in the game. I didn't realize I just thought he'd be so upset. And I know there are some extremes to that we unfortunately see in the YouTube moments, but for the most part, that's not going to happen. As we try and work with athletes on that identity piece, and that also kind of spills into that social approval that the athletes tend to feel like they have to have. I think that's an important exercise and part of that work that we do with athletes and teams as well, too.
Yeah, I love that you brought in the parents idea there. I've worked with a number of parent and athlete kind of combinations at the same time. And something I'll hear a lot from like younger athletes is that they feel like their parents are putting a lot of pressure on them. And when they say that in front of their parents and their parents go, like, that's not my intention. Like, I'm here just to support you. And so there's like this interpretation disconnect that I think, having a strong sense of like, I'm my parents' son. Like, I'm not their athlete, I'm their son. Like, that is an important distinction to have. And to your point, it can get blurred sometimes, and that can have some negative outputs. So that's a great point. Mike, I know you're also a really big hockey fan, so I wanted to get your unique perspective on the Stanley Cup playoffs this year. What are some things you've been watching out for? What are some things that have piqued your interest?
Yeah, and one of the things has been if the Colorado Avalanche are just going to steamroll through the entire series, because they've been the top team in the NHL this year. And to see Vegas kind of throw the first punch, if you will, maybe not physically, but metaphorically in that first game is interesting. And it seems like I've seen that in longer series game where it's a 7-game series where the visiting team comes in and kind of, and not only the upset, but lands the first punch, if you will. And it kind of knocks the more favored team kind of back into reality. Because I think a lot of times what happens is we talk a lot about focus and staying on point. And Anthony mentioned, what's important right now. As a visiting team, you have a lot of things that could go against you, a raucous crowd. We're not favored. We're supposed to get blown out. But for a lot of visiting teams, they can turn that around and then get hyper focused on, what, the crowd's going to be against us. We're not favored to win. We're expected to lose. So they start playing what we try and do all the time with our athletes and teams, start playing just real loose and trust in their own physical abilities and going, we're playing with nothing to lose here because there's no expectations, which obviously we deal with a lot as well too. And also they become hyper focused. If we want to shut out the crowd noise and just focus in on what we need to do, what do we need? The process there is to focus on 3 or 4 process cues. This is what we're going to hone in on, and this is what we're going to do to the best of our ability. And a lot of times that turns out to be a really good game, and that's what Vegas had the other night with Colorado. Same thing with the Montreal Canadiens. They've struggled for a long time. They are the kind of poster team for the NHL. Hockey was born in Canada. It's Canada's sport. Montreal's like Canada's team. The Maple Leafs have struggled for years, but Montreal's had a history of Stanley Cup wins, and a lot of Hall of Famers come out of Montreal, but they've struggled for a long time. And to see them get past Buffalo and also to play really well in the first game against Carolina is kind of the same thing. They've been able to kind of rally around the fact that, we've got nothing to lose. I think of the Boston Red Sox when they broke the curse 20 some years ago, and Johnny Damon's mantra at the time was, why not us? It's time. Why not us? After 80 some years, it's like everybody's always thinking we're going to lose, but this time it's why not us? And that's how they came back from 3-0 against the Yankees in that series and ended up winning the World Series as well too. So I think there's a lot going on here, but it's just kind of fun to see some of that. But I really believe you're the underdog, so you're playing loose, nothing to lose, and you're trusting yourself ultimately. And this is a good team. It's not like they're playing one of the worst teams in the NHL, and you're just letting it fly. And you're narrowing what your focus is. Instead of focusing in on 47 different things, we're just going to focus on the 2 or 3 things that we know we could do well and we could control, and let's see where the chips fall. And they ended up falling in the right spot after that first game.
Yeah, that's a great analysis. I think that's, the idea of pressure almost necessitating the outcome you're worried about. We say, the self-fulfilling prophecy, but if you're Colorado and you're worried, like, don't lose this, right? You're the favorite. Like, all you can do is mess this up. That puts a lot of that pressure on you, that then what you're thinking about is messing up. And that's what affects the outcome. That's what creates that outcome you're worried about. So, when you think about it as like, what if, or why not us, right? Rather than, no, let's not screw this up. I think those are worlds apart and obviously have very different impacts on the ice. Thank you very much for that. I appreciate your analysis. Anthony, do you have any hockey thoughts there about the Stanley Cup playoffs at all?
I don't know about hockey. I've been following the NBA a little bit.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, what have you been following with the NBA?
I mean, kind of, but the Thunder Spurs series has been, I think, pretty interesting, particularly with like the Spurs. I think they had the youngest starting lineup in like NBA history in the playoffs this past couple days. I think the average age was like 23 years old. And like thinking about it within the context of the series, where like OKC is a team that draws a lot of fouls, maybe draws a lot of like questionable calls. Like, how do you regulate your emotions in that moment? Particularly when maybe you look at the replay and somebody's just like overacting and they get the foul call. That's incredibly frustrating to play against, particularly when you're, 22 years old in the, the Western Conference Finals, competing for a chance for the NBA Finals. I think being able to like, how do you let go of that? How do you regulate it? Where do you put your attention after that happens? Do you go talk to the ref? Do you just let it go? What's the game plan after that? And I think it's an interesting dynamic to look at, because it looked like the other night the Spurs didn't do a great job of it, whereas in game one they did a pretty solid job taking a double overtime win in Oklahoma City. And I think the article that you're going to mention a little bit has a lot of interventions or skills to kind of help with that.
Yeah. I almost see some parallels too between, what you're saying with the Spurs being a young team and also like the Las Vegas Knights in the NHL. I know they're a couple years old now, but they don't have that legacy to lean back on where like the Canadians might or OKC might. And so I wonder if that same mechanism is in play, where it's like we're playing with nothing to lose. A lot of those guys, this is probably the first time they've played in an NBA Finals or an NBA playoffs rather, and so that pressure isn't really there for teams like the Knights, teams like, the Spurs. But you make a great point, especially when you're saying that Kansas City has been doing a lot of like kind of poking, it seems like they're doing a lot of like things that would really frustrate players, drawing fouls or making bad fouls. And if that keeps happening, it's really frustration inducing to play against that. So it's increasingly important that you have some sort of, release valve or some way to deal with that. Otherwise, what we saw or what we've said about playing tight is really what will happen, playing, and especially in basketball, if you're playing tight, you're not going to come out on top. So I think those are some really interesting kind of parallel stories that I see some connections with. Well, I think that wraps up the current news section here. I think those are the big stories of sports, and I appreciate both of your perspectives on those. I think, it's hard for one person to be on top of all the different sports stories. So the fact that we all have different interests, I think, provides a really interesting conversation. So I do want to move on to our next topic here, which will feed into our main topic. But we want to talk a little bit about current research in the field. We always want to make sure that what we're doing has that scientific backing and we have the data to back up the techniques that we use. So the big study that we want to talk about today came out earlier this year about ACT. This is acceptance and commitment therapy. In this context, it was sport-specific acceptance and commitment therapy. But the main idea with acceptance and commitment therapy, which we'll have Anthony talk about a little bit because he has some great experience with it, but it's the idea that you're accepting the situation that you're in rather than trying to fix it and force it, right? So there's always in sports going to be suboptimal conditions, whether it be, the humidity on a basketball court makes the wood a little bit more sticky, or playing outside, it's a little bit cold, or on a soccer pitch, it's a little bit dewy, right? There's always something that you could focus on. And ACT really works hard to get athletes to come to terms with these things, right? To recognize that everybody plays on the same field. Everybody has these same suboptimal conditions. And what we have to do is play our best and compete our best given whatever those circumstances are. Like I said, Anthony will give us a little bit more details there, but in general, this study took 95 national level athletes, which again is a great population. In sports psychology, we often talk about under-trained or non-trained populations. So this being an elite group of athletes, it really shows that these techniques work with trained individuals, not just the amateur athletes. They ran these athletes through, 95 of these athletes through a 6-week ACT trial. So again, just teaching athletes the skills to accept different circumstances and to reduce some of that cognitive dissonance that they feel between ideal states and reality. Upon post-testing, they found that the athletes who went through this training had higher psychological well-being. So they were just happier. They were more satisfied with their sport, with their day-to-day life. They experienced higher mental well-being. So this is just overall satisfaction, life satisfaction, and happiness. They had higher mental flexibility, which we've talked about in the context of mental toughness a number of times, the ability to adapt to a tough situation rather than force your way through it. And then lastly, they showed lower depression symptoms. And this is maybe subclinical depression. So it's more, moment to moment rather than overall clinical depression. But I still think that's a very important finding that they uncovered. So given some of those findings and what this research group did, Anthony, I'd love to hear, what your practical experience has been and how you've seen some benefits with this with your athletes.
Yeah, I love ACT. I think it's awesome, and it's one of the new third wave approaches is what they would call it in clinical psych to treatment, and it's been shown to be really effective with high performance populations, not just clinical populations. And I think the idea with this article, they kind of took it from, not to get really clinically and researchy, but they took it from what's called the MAC approach, the mindful acceptance and commitment. And it was developed by, I think it was Gardner and Moore in 2003. And the idea is 3 fundamental things. It's mindfulness, cognitive diffusion, and values-based actions. So I think starting kind of maybe with the values piece of it is I found that it's really helpful individually and within a team to maybe discuss the values or have values. I think a lot of the coaches out there maybe do that, but how are we doing that? Are the athletes involved in the process? Are we just assuming that the values are going to be the same each year, even with a different team? Particularly in college sports at the highest level, you're getting a new team every 6 months with the NIL. So I think being able to be, like the article said, psychologically flexible is really important. So giving everybody the opportunity to maybe have this discussion with values, and I've done this with teams before, and I give them this really big sheet of values, and I have them pick out 3 or 5, and we all get Post-it notes and we post them on the wall, and then we see if there's any recurring themes. So sometimes maybe it's resilience is one that we all picked out a lot, or maybe there's a couple that are the same, and then maybe there's some dialogue about what should be the values of this team, and then leading into the cognitive diffusion piece. So cognitive diffusion, when we're having feeling really anxious, we're probably very fused to all the thoughts we're having. I'm anxious, or I never perform well under pressure, or whatever the thought might be in that moment. Whereas when you're maybe in those flow states or peak performance states, you're not being attached to any of the thoughts that you have at all. And the idea is great performances or playing well isn't the absence of negative thoughts or the absence of positive thoughts. It's just being able to redirect your attention and focus to what's important in the moment. So a really simple activity that people could try, don't do this if you're driving, is just putting your hands over your face like this, and then trying to look around the room and notice everything that's in you around the room. So if my voice is a little muffled, it's because my hands are in front of my face. But if you slowly put your hands down, you get a better view of the room. And my hands are still there. And in this metaphor, this exercise, your thoughts are your hands. They're always they're going to continue to be there, but maybe we can just let them kind of sit on our lap or on our side and just notice that they're there instead of being attached to them. Because when they're right in front of our face, it's really hard to perform our best.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the integration of the mindfulness component to it as well.
100%. And just to jump in here really quickly, that's something that Novak Djokovic talks about a lot. So he's, excuse me, one of the best tennis players I would say that's ever lived. but he talks a lot about how he has probably more negative thoughts than anyone else that he knows. But it's his ability to, like you said, put your hands down, put those thoughts down, that is better than trying to get rid of them. So I didn't mean to interrupt your thought pattern there, but I just think, anytime that the professional athletes, the best in their field, are mimicking and mirroring what we're talking about, it's worthwhile pointing out.
Yeah, absolutely. And like the negative thoughts, like another metaphor for it too, is like they're just people passing by in a bus. Like we've all seen people on a bus before. How many faces do we remember of those people on the bus? Probably like zero. You're going to continue to have the negative thoughts, but maybe we can just kind of observe them drive on by just like they do on a bus. And if we're less attached to it, that gives us the opportunity to redirect our focus to what's important now. And I think that's where like this mindfulness component of it comes into play. Can we like be observing our thoughts? Can we be less attached to it and then redirect the focus to the here and now? Because I think the challenging part, and I think we'll probably get into it a little bit, is like reframing the thoughts, feeling relaxed, having the positive affirmations. Is that helpful for some? Definitely. But I think there's a big population of people where you're trying to grasp that control that we don't have control over. Like you're not going to be able to control your thoughts. You're not going to be able to control the anxiety. You're not going to be able to control how your body reacts to stressful situations in a really unpredictable world such as sports. So it seems almost like wasted energy, whereas maybe we can just observe it and be in the moment and let go of the things that are affecting us.
Yeah, absolutely. I think your kind of outline there is spot on. One thing we don't get from the research is really the felt experience of the athletes. So I'd love to hear your experience, and Mike, yours as well, if you've used this technique. Kind of how it's received. Is it something that people are receptive to? Is it something that you maybe have to do a little convincing on? What's been your experience in that regard?
Yeah, one of the first things I do, especially working with teams, and individual athletes as well too, is the awareness piece. And to piggyback on what Anthony was mentioning, we do a lot of, and it's been interesting, and I'd love to get both your guys' opinion on this. Sometimes when I use the word mindfulness, I get eye rolls because someone has heard it. That means, you're taking me down a path. They have a perception of what that might be, and they don't want to go down that path. So we try and use different wording in terms of that, but it's essentially that. And we try and help our athletes and our teams understand more of that awareness piece and where are your thoughts at, and becoming aware and getting better of that awareness is really almost a first step to what Anthony mentioned of understanding where your thoughts are. That yes, you can't control them, but if you know that they're all of a sudden now that you start to realize, wait a minute, my thoughts are kind of taking over here, that's a great first step. I always throw my daughter under the bus on this one because she likes to bite her fingernails. When she realizes that she's biting her fingernails, guess what? She stops biting her fingernails. Now, she may not have a great strategy on how to continue to not biting her fingernails, but the very first step is noticing that. And so I work a lot with individual athletes and teams, and I know we all do, about getting better at that awareness piece. And then to Anthony's point, start to redirect how can we use a lot of label the thought or label the emotion, and I know Ian and you and I have talked a lot about this, about using an old-fashioned pen and paper, the tactile function of writing some of that stuff down is helpful in diffusing that impact that thought or emotion might have for us as well too. And then let's identify what's important now. What are our cues for the moment? We have a tee shot coming up on hole number 10. I can't think about, if I understand where my thoughts are in a moment, that's a great first start. But what do I need to think about right now to execute my tee shot to the best of my ability? And away you go. So it is extremely spot on for what we do with all of our athletes and our teams.
I think it's interesting that you said there's like some resistance to the idea of mindfulness, because I felt that as well. And I think it comes from this idea that like mindfulness is somehow like sitting in a freshly mowed field, like,
right,
staring at the clouds go by. And I think, that is one aspect of it. That is kind of a thing to, a way that this can come about. But when you think about sports, it's there's even more to attend to, right? Like the point of trying to immerse yourself in that like idyllic, field setting and listen to the birds and things, that's a way to like reduce all the noise. And so you're really focusing on the fewest things that you possibly can, right? Like the skin on your arms and whatever that might be. But then when you turn that to a sports focused, the mindfulness is not about the tiny sensations that you're feeling like it would be sitting in a field. Now it's about the game, it's about the flow of the play, it's about your energy. So it's the same process of being mindful, being attentive to yourself, but you're just focusing on the sport rather than sitting in a field. And I think those two things it's the same process, it just kind of comes, it may be more popularized the one way, the more like Buddhist version of this. But, I do think that the idea, we've talked about this before, the idea of awareness, acceptance, and action, using that word of awareness rather than mindfulness, I think could be that piece that gets us over the finish line.
Yeah, I think we've all run into the mindfulness vocab conundrum. And I think it's an opportunity to have the conversation with the people or the group you're working with. Where are you getting your definition of mindfulness from? Is it from TikTok? Is it from Instagram? Chances are maybe that's not the best place to get it. And like, if that is where how are they defining it? How are they talking about mindfulness? Because I think in the context in which we're talking about it is like a non-judgmental awareness of the moment.
100%.
And that's where like, and so I think from there, that's the opportunity where I usually take it, is to go from like, well, have you ever been like in a peak performance state? Have you ever been like in the zone? And everybody usually is like, of course, yeah. And it's like, have you had any thoughts? No. Have you had any like thought of time? No. Have you had any worries about the future? No. And I was like, well, mindfulness has a lot of similarities with that. And I think that's the buy-in point right there, is that like, if you're able to be mindful, you're able to maybe not enter the zone, because I think once you start looking for it, you don't find it, but you can take all the correct steps to get there using mindfulness. And then that's when you get a little buy-in, because they're like, oh, well, if I can get into a peak performance state a little bit quicker, then I'll listen to what you're saying, even though I don't know if I want to do it.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. Well, I think the research review in this conversation blends perfectly into our main topic today, and that's really unpacking the idea of control the controllables. This is kind of an industry trope and a coaching trope. Everybody talks about this, but I think it's really important to look at the dichotomy of those two things, because on the surface of it, they're opposites, right? Well, on one hand, you're trying to control everything, and on the other, you're recognizing that there are things that you can't control. And so I wanted to get kind of your opinion and maybe bounce ideas off each other about how that works, right? How you can go from a mindset of, I want to control everything I can, but then also have a moment where you let go of things. I think, we call this dichotomous thinking, where two things are true at the same time, two things and two mindsets are true at the same time. So, in my estimation, and I'll give you kind of my ideas first, then I want to hear your thoughts, but I think the control piece comes in training, in practice, in preparation. This is where you can take the time and think, what are all of the things I need to, let's say you've got a game coming up, put in my bag for that game, right? Absolutely everything you can think of, prepare, plan, control that environment. But then there becomes, and I think it's a time thing, there becomes a moment where, half an hour away from the game, an hour away from the game, you kind of relinquish that control and you say everything is in place, or it doesn't have to be in place. And it's that transition that I think some athletes struggle with, because they step out on the pitch or the pool and they're still in that control mindset. And the control mindset then leads to stress. It leads to pressure. It leads to performance anxiety, outcome anxiety. Whereas if you're able to push that button and say, all right, now it's out of my hands. Now all I can do is control my attitude and my effort. That's, the competition mindset. So for me, I think it's somewhat of a temporality thing. How close to game time are you? How close to, competition are you? But I'd love to hear some of your thoughts as far as tips on how to control the controllables, and also how to accept kind of those things you can't control.
Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes my thoughts are like, how much of this need for control is just a product of your own poorly managed anxiety about the future event?
Sure.
Because I think a lot of the times that's what usually pops up. I think anxiety, when we think of anxiety or stress or worry, it's like a worry about a future event. And the idea is that like, you're not going to be able to predict the future at all. Like we are horrible at predicting the future, and like every study has proven that. Like, no offense to the weather people out there, but they're not famous for getting it right. And I think the idea is like you're trying to control things that you just don't have any regulation or control over. The one thing I've done with people in the past is like, if you feel like the preparation's good, then now we have to trust it. And like, what does trust look like? Like a really simple activity that I've done in my office, like I have like stress balls, and I'm like, all right, ready, catch it. And then they catch it, and like throw it a little higher. All right, now throw it a little bit lower, and now throw it a little faster, throw it a little slower. And afterwards, I'm like, did you think about any of that? And they usually say no. And I'm like, right, you just trusted yourself to throw the ball. You didn't think like, if I aim my arm a little bit higher and loft it a little bit higher, it'll go higher. You just did it. And I think the same idea can be applied to when it comes time to perform. Like, you need to just allow yourself to trust it, which is easier said than done. But I think like the activity is a good metaphor to like show what trust looks like in a high stress situation.
Yeah, and that's fantastic stuff, because when you even read about stars in the game that do the same thing, when I've read stuff about how Steph Curry prepares to dive into the NBA, or when I read stuff about Kobe Bryant and how he prepped, it was almost a sense of curiosity and humbleness and a drive to try and use that control piece to try and find out, even at their level, how can I get better? And I don't remember if it was Kobe or Steph or both. They would reach out to competitors. What are you seeing in my game that can be improved? And so they would work on that and to be relentless about it. And I've even heard, I want to say I read it about Beyonce, on how she could be really, really controlling as she's rehearsing and getting ready for a tour, to the detriment sometimes of the folks around her as well too. But all three of them, when they talk about getting into performance, they're like, I'm going to be as confident or as arrogant in the belief in my own abilities to let it go. And I don't control anything of that at this point, because I know my prep is where it needs to be. And I'm just going to use the term I used a little bit ago, just let it fly, because I know that's where I'm going to be. I talk with athletes all the time who are obviously student athletes, who at the time they want to try and control when they get into an exam. Exam is going to be something different. Maybe the instructor told them these are some of the things that are going to be on the exam, but it's their prep. Once they walk into that exam room, all that prep is what they want to kind of lean in on, and their confidence in their ability to answer those questions. And once they get better at that, and to Anthony's point, it's easier said than done. Once they can get better at that trusting phase, they physically almost exhale. And now it's like their focus gets better and their opportunity to get in the zone gets better as well too. And part of that, as when I've worked with athletes, is to try and practice that. So practice the performance piece, and practice that letting go piece, and practice that trust piece as well too. So absolutely understanding where you need to be controlling and when you need to just go, I'm good. I'm just going to I'm going to be on the tightrope, but I know I'm going to be safe.
Yeah, those are both great perspectives. I think, the thing, sometimes it's the easiest way to talk about the right way is to kind of eliminate the wrong ways. And that's maybe the approach that I want to take here in thinking about it. On the one hand, if you have this athlete that is kind of over controlling and is unable to turn that switch off when it's time to compete, I think that's where you get players that, or athletes that, like, they want to control the outcome. And then when they can't, that's the problem. That's when things show up, right? I remember as a swim coach, I'd say, like, what are we going to do in this race? And then I'd hear somebody tell me a time. They'd say, like, oh, I'm going to go 23.5. And you're like, how are you going to do that? Like, you don't have that accurate of a clock in your head. You can't control that. Like, what are you going to do? Like, you have to swim the race in a particular way to get the outcome. But if you're always thinking about, I'm going to control the outcome, you're going to play nervous, you're going to play tight, you're going to compete, under that stress, like we said. I think on the other side of it, though, if you're an athlete that is maybe too type B and too kind of laissez-faire about things, then you get the athlete that doesn't pack their bag. They get to it's the soccer field and they don't have their shin guards, right? Or, and this is kind of the other extreme where you're not controlling the things that are within your control. You're just kind of showing up and hoping everything is done for you. And so there needs to be both aspects, right? There needs to be control in preparation, but then release in competition, relax in competition. This came up maybe in terms of like goal setting strategies. But one thing I really like is the idea of throw your hat over the fence. So this goal setting strategy, I don't know who popularized it, but the idea is that like you don't know what's on the other side of the fence. You don't know what the future holds. But if you throw your hat over there, you put yourself, throw yourself in the ring, you're going to have to climb the fence and deal with what's on the other side. And that's kind of the same thing with sports is like you sign yourself up for the team. You signed yourself up for that game. You threw your hat over the fence. Now it's time to just go see and game, right? That's the mindset we really like is being a gamer. And so again, kind of back to my original point or kind of structure, how would you go about towing that line with an athlete, kind of teaching them to control the preparation and then relinquish that control at some point during competition or when the whistle blows?
Yeah, I think a lot of it just sounds like avoidance, like not wanting to throw your hat over the fence or maybe not doing the necessary things in practice to feel prepared for the game. Or like, the other thing that came up for me hearing you talk about is like the butterfly effect a little bit of like you doing all these things, like maybe being difficult in type A or maybe being a little too type B and forgetting things. How is that affecting the rest of the team? Because in some capacity, like that's selfish to do those two things and I think it's important to like recognize things happen outside of your own space in your own head, particularly in team sports. And I think a lot of the times, like I said, these are just maybe maladaptive coping skills that we've developed because at some point they were adaptive. And in reality, at this point in time, maybe it's not as helpful as it is, but that I think leads back to the avoidance. Like, are we just like experientially avoiding things that we think might feel uncomfortable? Are we trying to predict the future again? Because I think a lot of the times, especially within like the ACT framework, experiential avoidance is often the like center point of difficulties and like poor performance because we are trying to maybe predict the future, how we're going to feel if we don't get the result that we wanted. Or like maybe we're too scared to put the effort in because what happens if we do everything right and we don't get the result we want?
Yeah. Yeah, I think that would be a topic worth talking about, kind of the vulnerability of sports, the opportunity to really, without a doubt, put 100% of yourself on something and not know if it's going to succeed or fail. I think that's a very vulnerable, thing to do. And I think that would be, maybe a future podcast topic, but I think that's a great point.
Yeah.
And also,
I think just to like, I'll relate it back, but like they did a research study with professors who were up for tenure. And I say this all the time at work, this study, but researchers asked the professors like, hey, like, you're up for tenure. Like, how badly do you think it would affect your career if you didn't get tenure? And they were like, oh, it would ruin my career for the next 5 years. And they're like, all right, 5 years, kind of a long time. Like you can get another degree within 5 years.
Sure.
But they're like, okay, if you say it's 5 years, it's 5 years. So they asked the professors who didn't end up getting tenure, how badly did it affect your career? How bad was it? And they're like, oh, I was back on my feet in 6 months. So if like these PhD professors are 4.5 years wrong on their predictions of the future, what are the chances any of us are going to be right about our predictions of the future as well? And I think it shows like one, again, that we're horrible at predicting the future. And it like goes back to affective forecasting. Like we underscore our ability to be resilient in these difficult moments. Like the teachers underscored their ability to do, our professors underscored their ability to be resilient by 4.5 years.
Yeah.
Like even some studies with like veterans who have lost limbs show that like they get basically back to their same level of happiness even after losing a limb. We are so incredibly resilient and so able to bounce back from difficult things and mistakes and losses and trials, but we often underscore our ability to do it. And like it's just your brain trying to keep you and making you feel safe.
Yeah, I love that. And to tie it back to, I mean, like I said, this whole podcast has kind of been interconnected, but the idea of mental flexibility, right? That what you're talking about seems to be the ability to adapt to situations that you didn't see. And so you can see if somebody was incredibly rigid, say that professor that didn't get tenure, if they were really rigid in their thinking, it might actually ruin 5 years of their life, right? Because they wake up every day and they remind themselves about that thing. Whereas a more mentally flexible professor might be able to say, okay, well, that door closed, let's start looking for new doors, and then now, like you said, those new doors present themselves, and then they're back on their feet in 6 months. So going back even to before that, I think it can be an identity question too. Like, let's say your identity of being a professor is 98% of your identity and you don't get tenure, that's a 98% failure in your life. Whereas if you have a strong family, maybe you're an athlete, you exercise recreationally, you have other things to lean back on, that all helps kind of get back on your feet. And so I absolutely think it's that, like, are you able to just kind of let go of that control aspect a little bit and let the future come to you rather than you have an idea and force the future that you maybe think might be there? Because I think that's where you get a lot of that anxiety, pressure, frustration, things that we're trying to avoid.
And I think just to follow up on that, I think we as human beings are hardest on ourselves. And that's from a personal perspective, inward, outwardly. But I also think that's outward to inward. We almost feel like we're supposed to be that way. When I work with athletes, one of the things, and I know we've talked about this before, but we try and answer those questions. What went well today and what didn't go so well? But we always try and start out with the productive part. What was productive during your tournament over the weekend, during your game last night, or during the last week and whatnot? Because the go-to is always pulling out something that was negative. I always use the golf example. Some golfer might have shot the round of their life, but when you ask them about it, they're going to want to talk about hole number 10 that they double bogeyed for the next 3 hours. And they almost feel like that's what I have to do, because it's back to that arrogance in performance where you feel like I can't talk about, I want to be confident in my abilities, but I don't feel like I can talk about it because I don't want to be arrogant about it. So I have to think negatively in ourselves. And I also feel like individuals feel that the go-to is the negative piece. So it's hard for them to pull out the positive and the small wins and add to real reasons why they should add to their confidence that they can tap into when things get challenging. So when we talk about resilience and mental toughness, and however way you want to define that, a lot of it is having real reasons to feel good about your own performance, even if it wasn't perfect, and even if it is something that you don't want to, we talk about goal setting, get to in a final point. This is not where I eventually want to be, but I see myself getting better. And I think that's a struggle as human beings, just in general, let alone sports performers who tend to put that extra pressure on themselves just in general.
Yeah, and kind of connecting it back to the idea of control versus relinquishing control. There's a quote that I love. It's just like an internet quote, I guess, but it's the idea that a bird sitting on a tree or landing on a tree branch is never worried about the branch breaking because it trusts its wings. And I think that is kind of a great metaphor for sports, because you don't make a play because the play is going to be success. You make a play because you know that it's going to create something that you can handle, like that you trust in your ability to deal with what's coming next. And I think, going back to Anthony, that idea of trust is huge. You need to trust in your preparation, your training, in you as an athlete. I think the idea of like over control comes from that idea of like, I don't trust myself in situations that I don't know. And I think, going back to that bird idea, it's like, if the bird doesn't trust its wings, it lands on a branch, that branch breaks, it's not going to land on another branch, right? But if you have a you have a bird that knows it can fly, then no branch is off limits. No game, no situation is off limits if you have that level of trust. Well, guys, I appreciate all of your thoughts there on our control the controllables idea. Like I said, it's great to hear different perspectives. You guys are working in a little bit different environments, and I think you bring some fantastic perspectives. So I really appreciate our conversation there. Kind of moving here towards wrapping up, we do want to have a mental fitness challenge that builds on last month. So for those listeners from previous podcasts, we had you write down and keep a daily wins journal. That would be writing down things at the end of your day that you were proud of, things that went well throughout your day. And then the second piece was, we wanted you in parentheses or next to it to write down a couple of personality traits that led to those wins. If it was something that you worked really hard on, maybe you think of yourself as a hard worker. And so now you should have a list of 30-ish, small wins and personality traits that you're proud of. Our mental fitness challenge this month is going to be to take that list and then write a story about it. So this could be, a mental story, or like Mike said, writing things down. But we want you to take the perspective of a comic book writer. You're writing a new superhero and you are the character, the main character. What would be your superpowers? What types of crimes would you be fighting? What types of things would you be better than the average person at? And I want you to drive those categories, those things that you identified about yourself. So are you, someone that's super hardworking? What would that superpower be? Take some time to think about this. This should be a very personal and reflective idea. You definitely don't have to share it with anyone or share it with us, but maybe if you come up with a really cool title for yourself, maybe you post it on in the comment section below. But that is our mental fitness challenge for the month, writing a superhero story about yourself based on your daily wins. Mike, Anthony, do you have anything to add to the daily fitness challenge or the monthly fitness challenge, and any advice you have for our listeners?
No, I've used something similar in the past where I've asked athletes to come up with a persona. So if an athlete has, for example, a famous athlete in their sport that they really like or admire or whatnot, and to pull out their traits that they like, both on the physical side and the mental side. And then when they're in their next performance, whether they're up to bat as a baseball player or over a putt as a golfer or on a penalty shot in hockey or something like that, try and enter into that persona a little bit as well too, just to kind of help with the confidence piece and a little bit of diffusing some of the emotions that they might be feeling at the time. So very apropos.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to be too Freudian about it, but we have, the id, ego, and superego. And I think what we're talking about here is building out that idea of the superego, like your idealized self, to what you said, and then to the idea of being like a superhero. That's the persona you want to compete with. And I think that, like you said, gives you a lot of psychological reprieve, confidence, and a lot of performance outcomes that will follow. So yeah, I highly recommend you do some deep thinking on this if you're listening, and really think about what, that idealized self and even, that superhero self version of yourself would look like. So
I think we talked a lot about some like real practical things that people can maybe start to practice or think about, or not think about, or be less attached to moving forward. And I think it'd be an exciting idea to maybe do talk about more of like the, I would say like even like perfectionism that's associated with sports. I think a lot of this is maybe a product of that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll definitely have to hop on next month and maybe talk about that and kind of the vulnerability of sports. I think that might be a good kind of teaser for next month, but absolutely. Well, for everyone listening, that's a wrap for episode 22 of the Mental Barbell Podcast. If you found value in today's discussion, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with a teammate or coach. For more mental performance insights and tips and personal coaching, visit thementalbarbell.com or follow us on social media at The Mental Barbell. As always, please like, review, and subscribe to our channel and help share it around to athletes that need it. Thanks, everyone. Pretty good.